what's the one thing that everyone can say in Chinese?
你好.
你好, okay, or 谢谢, well done. I was looking for 你好. I think more people can say that. So I promise I won't bore you by speaking too much Chinese myself, but I will read a poem or two as we go along. So a bit about me, I started learning Chinese in 2009. I'm primarily self-taught, so I did actually come to the Confucius Institute here for one little course to start me off learning characters. My oral vocabulary is about 2,600 words, so I'd consider that intermediate or upper intermediate. My written vocabulary is about 200 characters. I speak Chinese at home. It's the language of our family. So my wife is from Hebei province. My mother-in-law doesn't speak any English, which is really helpful for me because it forces me to speak Chinese every day. And I speak Chinese to my two children. Their mother tongue is Chinese. They learned Chinese before English. And I've eavesdropped on many conversations with old Chinese ladies on the trains of Sydney and occasionally joined them. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about Usana, and it gave me an opportunity to learn the Chinese word for multi-level marketing company. So it's really, these are the moments that help you learn, is that you hear two people speaking, you grab your dictionary, look up multi-level marketing, okay, it's 纯销, okay, I'll just go speak to them and explain to them what that is, and that was a lot of fun. So yes, this is when I met Richard. This was the Chinese Bridge competition back in 2016. We tried to impress the Chinese, were they diplomats? I don't know. Various people, nice Chinese people. We tried to impress them with our Chinese. I'm not sure what level of success I had. And I also have a YouTube channel where I teach Chinese focused on micro lessons. So the idea is that lessons that are less than 2 minutes each. This beautiful banner was done by my friend here who's recording me, very skilled there. And it's really hobby. Chinese is my hobby, right? It's not a very large channel. Cool. So a bit about Mandarin Chinese. It's the world's most spoken language. It's one of over 200 Chinese topolegs. As far as I understand, Chinese people tend to use the word dialect, but I think that is technically incorrect because the topoleg, the Chinese, like Shanghai Hua, Shanghainese, is a different language to Mandarin. Sure, there's a relationship, but they're not mutually intelligible. So Mandarin Chinese is the primary Chinese language, but it is only one of 200 or over 200. It's the language of the Han people. They constitute about 92% of the Chinese population, and it's the official lingua franca of China, so language of government, commerce, law, etc. It's the most spoken language in the world. When I researched the numbers, the estimates vary, but between 800 million and 1 billion people. So if you randomly selected 7 people in the world, and your sample was almost perfectly random, chances are one of them speaks Mandarin. If you randomly selected 17, the chances are one of them speak English. So that just gives you an idea of the ratios. In Chinese, Mandarin, which is here 普通话, is it's called the common tongue, the country language, or the Han language, since it's the language of the Han people. And it's very different from Indo-European languages, which makes it a little bit difficult, or a little bit more difficult to learn when you come from this background. Chinese, or Mandarin Chinese, and as far as I understand, most, if not all, Chinese dialects, topolegs, are tonal languages, which means that the pronunciation of a single word includes a tone. So it's an essential part of the pronunciation of a word. So I have some examples here. There are 5 tones in Chinese, depicted there by the flat, rising, falling, then rising, falling quickly, and then no tone, the tone that is no tone. So these are actually 5 different words. Ma, 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 ma. So it's a little bit difficult in the beginning when learning Chinese to distinguish between the various tones, but it's very essential. And it's one of those interesting insights that you can gain in a minute or you can miss for a lifetime. So people who learn Chinese, some of them just grasp this, and it relates back to we were talking about being musical earlier. As part of a learning language, Chinese is especially, it rewards people who are more musical in that sense. So ma, 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 there's 5 different words. It has a logographic writing system, so it doesn't have an alphabet. The characters don't tell you how to pronounce them, or they contain limited information about how to pronounce them. They're logograms, so they're like paintings of real-life objects originally, and they've evolved over time, similar to some Egyptian hieroglyphics. And the characters, as far as I understand, Chinese characters are the oldest continuously used system of writing in the world. Cool. So let's talk about learning Chinese from an English background. These are really some more practical, this is the practical side of things. I'm just going to dive into how to go about the process. So this is my suggested progression. If anyone wants to learn Chinese, this is how I suggest you go about it. First, learn tones. The time frame for that can be a day, it can be a week. As I said, some people don't get it in a lifetime. But you really can't learn Chinese successfully without first knowing tones. So I'd actually suggest people start there and master those, because even if you learn 300 words, but you never grasp the tones in the first place, then you have to go relearn all 300 of those words to figure out which tone you were supposed to use. Then, from tones, learn oral Chinese. It's very loose what I mean by that. There's no exact number of words in the vocabulary that you need to acquire, per se. But I'd suggest that the format of that is to first learn a word, learn any particular word. Second, practice that word in a sentence. And by so doing, you will inherit, in a sense, the grammar. You'll get a sense of grammar. And rinse and repeat that process. So this is how I learned Chinese. Learn a new word, practice that in the correct sentence. How do you know it's correct? You ask someone who's a native speaker, right? That's probably the best way to do that. Get a word, practice it in a sentence, and that's the formula. So, for instance, my YouTube channel is merely, each video is a single word and 3 sentences of how to use it, and that's the end of the end of the video. And then I'd suggest, after you've learned a good amount of oral Chinese, to then learn written Chinese. Now, there's nothing wrong with people who want to learn Chinese characters just for the fun of it. I have a good friend, he will look at the characters and say, oh, that's the character for fish. They know it's the character for yu. Right? So the main reason I tell that anecdote is because learning the English translation of Chinese characters doesn't ultimately make sense, because the grammar is completely different and the meanings can be different or not neatly translated into English. So Chinese characters really only make sense in the context of Chinese. And something that I'm sure everyone who's learned a language can agree with, native speakers, you really need access to them. So let's unpack that. If the first suggestion was to learn tones before learning words, if you don't learn tones, you'll have at best dull pronunciation, at worst unintelligible, people simply won't understand you, or you'll use the wrong word altogether. I wrote here, you'll sound like Mark Zuckerberg. So I don't know if any of you have heard Mark Zuckerberg speaking Chinese. Actually, I should first praise him. It's amazing that anyone tries to learn a language. I don't think it's ever something that we need to make fun of, and please take this in the spirit that it's intended. But in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, he has been criticized that he basically sounds like a 4-year-old in Chinese. So if you learn tones and you have the tones correct, then suddenly the quality of your Chinese can rise significantly. And yes, I've met people who've learned for over 10 years and still haven't grasped tones. So it's just one of those things where, again, intuition that can be gained in a moment or missed in a lifetime. I'd suggest people gain intuition through practice and not learn grammar conceptually. So what that means is, of course it's okay to be curious about how the grammar of a language works and why it's structured in a certain way, but you shouldn't rely on the conceptual understanding when you're speaking. When you're speaking, you don't have 2 minutes to sit there and figure out how the syntax of this sentence should be. Basically, you need to rely on a more intuitive understanding, which really comes as a result of practice, and more practice. So this is just a little thing about documenting vocabulary. This is a Google sheet that I have, and you can see on the left-hand side there are different Pinyin words. This is my vocabulary sheet. When I first started learning in 2009, I created this spreadsheet, and I've been using it ever since. The reason I know how many words are in my vocabulary is because I've written every single one down. And I have sentences here that are not always complete, but I've not always completed all the words, but at least they're there. As I go through and practice the different words, I mark them in different colors based on how quickly I reacted to the word when I read it. So red means something that I completely forgot, or it took me at least 5 seconds to react to this word. Green means something that I use frequently and I have used recently and I'm very comfortable with. And orange means something that I've heard and I understand, but I'm not actively using it myself. So this can be a very practical way to practice your vocabulary, is be very mindful, be very aware of your own understanding of each and every word as you go along. Cool. So China has a very rich and old poetry that is extremely famous and meaningful. Today I'm going to speak about Tang Shi, which is poems from the Tang Dynasty dating 600 to 900 AD. And we'll consider a few of them and their English translations. But before we begin, I'm going to explain that these are actually my translations of these poems. The main reason is when I've looked online at the various translations, I felt a little bit dissatisfied with some of the translation. I felt that and the main reason, this is not offense at all, the main reason is when someone's a native Chinese speaker and their English is their second language, it can be difficult for them to translate the poem really, really well. Whereas if it's reverse, you just have to understand the poem really well, but then you have all the intuition in English to actually translate it. So I think the best translations of poems are not done by the native speakers of that language. They're done by people who the native speaker is the target language. Here are a couple of thoughts about translating poems. When I translate poems, I think of 3 dimensions. The first is accuracy, meaning what are the precise meanings of the original words, and can we precisely capture that? So some poems, when they translate them, the destination poem, the end poem that comes out is not really accurate. It doesn't really resemble the earlier one. The second is beauty. How can we capture the beauty of the original work? So sometimes you can have a very accurate translation, but it's not a poem anymore by the time it got through that translation. And the third is rhyming. If the original poem had a rhyming structure, can we try to emulate that rhyming structure? And this is very difficult to balance all 3 of these. It's sort of a constrained design scenario. Again, and finally, the goal is not to explain the poem, it's to translate it. Explanation comes after that. Cool. So if you'll indulge me, firstly, I'll start with a poem called Chun Xiao, which the English translation is Spring Dawn, written by Meng Haoran. So, 春眠不觉晓，处处闻啼鸟，夜来风雨声，花落知多少. So this is my English translation. Sleeping in on a spring morn, sensing not the dawn. Everywhere is heard the tweeting of the bird. Come night and the wind rain sound. Unknown how many petals fell to the ground. So this poem is about spring dawn. And the first sentence is about how someone has a very nice sleep in and they can't sense that dawn has arrived. Second one is about how they hear the beautiful birds singing. The third one is about how night comes and it rains, there's a storm. And when they wake up in the morning, there are many petals, many flowers that have dropped to the ground. Who knows how many? So that's 春晓. Good, we're doing well for time. The second poem that I'll explain is 静夜思, translated to Nostalgia by Li Bai. It is 床前明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡. So this is my translation. Moonlight beams before the bed. Suspected frost on the ground. Raised head beholds the bright moon. Lowered head, nostalgic for hometown. So this poem is actually about, in ancient times, a traveler who lived far away from home, presumably for work or other purposes, and he's experiencing nostalgia for his hometown. So it's late at night, and it's a bright moon, it's a full moon. The moonlight is shining through the window onto his bed. It's cold, it's winter, so he suspects that there's frost on the ground. He raises his head and looks at the moon. but then lowers his head and thinks of his hometown. Cool. So good. Those are some two Chinese poems. There are many Chinese poems. I think I've memorized about 8 or 9. So really, there are so many more. But those are some of the most famous Chinese poems. Now I'll talk a bit about idioms in Chinese. So one thing I love about, again, poems and especially idioms in Chinese is that modern Chinese speakers have relatively good access to ancient Chinese thought. What I'm saying is, even though Chinese itself has evolved, still the poems and the phrases are inherited from ancient times, and people who use them today understand them. What that means is that they have access to thought that is from a very, very long time ago in their day-to-day language. And so that's one of the most enjoyable parts of learning Chinese. Cool, so Chinese has various phrases, but among them there's a particular type of phrase called a 4-character idiom. Usually these are metaphors or stories compacted into 4 characters. As I say here, what's really lovely about them is they capture the wisdom, the wit, and the terseness of Chinese thinking. It's a whole phrase in just 4 characters. Let's start with a 4-character idiom, and then I'll go to a phrase. So this is called 自相矛盾. It's the Chinese word for self-contradiction. So this is the story. In ancient times, there was a man who sold spears and shields. He used to boast, "My spears are the sharpest thing in the world. They can penetrate anything." A moment later, he would boast, "My shields are the toughest things in the world. Nothing can penetrate them." One day, a passerby asked him, "What would happen if you threw one of your spears at one of your shields?" This idiom, contradicting oneself, and a noun, 矛盾, contradiction, all come from this story. So the modern Chinese word for contradiction is 矛盾, and it literally means spear, shield. And it comes from this ancient story of this alleged salesperson who was bragging about his spears and his shields, and capturing this idea of a contradiction. And finally, one of my favorite Chinese phrases, there are so many that we could share, but this is definitely one of my favorite. 一桶水不响，半桶水晃荡. So 一桶水 means 1 bucket of water, a full bucket of water. 不响 doesn't make a noise. 半桶水, half a bucket of water. 晃荡, sloshes. So to fully translate, a full bucket of water doesn't make a noise. Half a bucket of water sloshes. What does this mean? Well, it's a metaphor where a full bucket of water represents a person who is full of knowledge and wisdom. And that person is generally quiet. Whereas a person who is only partial knowledge, partial wisdom, underdeveloped opinions, etc., speaks a lot, makes a lot of noise, expresses their opinion a lot, etc. What I love about this phrase is it captures that wit of Chinese thinking, where you have these wise people who have known a lot, and guess what? They're also very quiet and sometimes reserved people. Whereas young people, especially, can be very noisy all over the place because they haven't yet learned that wisdom.
Or Donald Trump.
I love getting to that. There's a special Chinese phrase just for Trump. Cool. So that's basically it from me. I think we're out of time. I think we have about 30 seconds, maybe 1 minute, if anyone has any questions.
Are there epic poems in Chinese? The ones you had were quite short.
That's right. Yeah, so actually, funnily enough, at our Chinese competition, they wanted us to memorize one of them, but we had 2 weeks, and they were like really, really long. So what? Nobody did it, basically. I ended up reading the longest poem that I knew, which was only a few sentences. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.